Welcome back to the Carbon Exposure Project, where we dive deep into the ideas, markets, and people shaping the future of climate finance. We're back for Season 3, where we continue to feature subject matter experts across policy, industry, and finance, speaking candidly about how market mechanisms can drive the energy transition and broader decarbonisation efforts. In this episode, I sit down with my good friend Alvin Lim, one of the most brilliant minds working today in carbon markets. Alvin's journey in climate and carbon finance began as a student at COP15 and has since taken him through global investment banking and into a leadership role at Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, where he built a 3-pillar thesis for investing in carbon markets. We explore Alvin's framework for carbon as an asset class, from compliance markets like the EU ETS and California, to project-based markets like nature-based solutions and direct air capture, and the emerging private infrastructure that underpins the ecosystem. Think MRV, legal structures, and trading platforms. We talk about how carbon can diversify investment portfolios, how to de-risk carbon projects for institutional capital, and why the often overlooked topic of vintage bias deserves a rethink. From Article 6 of the global coal phase-out, mentorship to market structure, this episode covers a lot of ground with insight, clarity, and a real sense of optimism about the role carbon markets can play in delivering net zero. I'm your host, Rene Velasquez. Join me as I get to speak with the people building the carbon markets of tomorrow, often over cocktails. Welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project.
Alvin, it's a pleasure to see you, man.
Likewise.
We've known each other for a while, and it's a great opportunity to actually get to sit down with you here on camera and on film for people to obviously benefit from your learned wisdom. Thank you very much for the opportunity to sit down. I know you're a busy man. So firstly, welcome to the Carbon Exposure Project. And then secondly, I really want to dive in and learn a little bit more about you. You have a very interesting background with your career so far in your journey. And as most people that I speak with, they haven't necessarily come into carbon markets in a very linear sort of pathway. There's a meandering and wandering path. I was hoping if you could give us a little bit of your background and then we can dive into some more sort of technical
That
stuff.
is one of the beauties of the carbon markets. People are coming from a diverse background.
I know.
But firstly, thanks you so much for having me here today, Rene.
It's a pleasure, man.
My journey with the climate movement actually came a full circle 15 years later. I remember the very first COP I attended. It was COP 15.
When was it? 15.
In Copenhagen.
Wow.
In 2009.
Yeah.
I was a student and representing a small youth group at COP 15 trying to advocate for climate action. Since then, I've gone on to a global investment bank to basically start my career as an equity research analyst, and then subsequently joined a sovereign wealth fund in Singapore.
One of the two.
One of the two, yes, where I finally started to spend more time looking at the carbon markets.
Yeah.
And during my time at the sovereign wealth fund, I started to develop this thesis around carbon markets across 3 main verticals.
Okay, please elaborate.
The first one was a compliance carbon market. Then we had the project-based carbon markets. And then we had private markets, or what I call the ecosystem enablers, right? So it was across these 3 buckets. And theoretically, for me, carbon market was a beautiful solution to fractionalize the cost of financing carbon abatement opportunities in the market. So the investment thesis across all 3 pillars were largely similar. Firstly, there was a hypothesis that carbon as an environmental externality needed to be priced, and this cost needed to be passed down to society and businesses in the form of a carbon price, and that price should rise over time. Now, if this hypothesis is true, then there are 2 types of opportunities or businesses that should do well in the carbon markets. The first one are businesses or carbon markets that directly benefit from a rising price in carbon. So think of this as compliance carbon market like the European Union or the California market. Prices go up, directly benefits people who own those assets. And the second one are companies that make money because there is a price in carbon. So think of it like a direct air capture or an afforestation nature-based project developer. So there was one group of companies. The second group of companies that could benefit from or create value in this market are actually people that took a cut out of a transaction, a carbon transaction. So think of these as ecosystem enablers, right, who are providing services to the carbon markets. And therefore, if the carbon market grows and the velocity of trading grows, so will this group of market participants grow.
And so does that include infrastructure providers,
It does.
exchanges?
Infrastructure providers, data providers, research and consulting businesses, legal services, financial services, insurance, the whole ecosystem enablers.
Yeah.
Right. So the thesis was that across these three pillars, there were opportunities to invest in both people who made money directly from price and carbon, and also people who were making money because there was ecosystem enablers that were generating value.
Okay.
Right. So that's kind of how I started studying the carbon markets. And subsequent to that, actually, it was at the Sovereign Wealth Fund back in 2021. I co-authored a paper that studied carbon markets as a potentially viable asset class for asset owners and asset managers.
Right.
In this paper, we highlighted that there was already a growing compliance market that was investable. Compliance market back in 2021 and even today cumulatively trades over $1 trillion a year.
Yeah.
So it's a highly liquid market. It's
Highly
big
liquid market.
with sufficient depth.
Yeah.
Right? The project-based carbon market was fairly nascent, but also growing rapidly. And back in 2021, we were already starting to see the emergence of certain carbon ecosystem service providers raising meaningful capital. And now, 3 years later, clearly there are a lot more companies raising hundreds of millions to service this segment.
Yeah.
So carbon as an asset class was starting to grow. But why invest in carbon? In that paper, we actually backtested and said, if an investor were to put a 5% hypothetical carbon allowance allocation into a 60-40 reference portfolio, which is the typical reference portfolio that asset managers would look at,
Yeah.
over a 30-year horizon, we think that this portfolio could generate between 50 and 70 basis points of extra performance.
Wow.
While improving volatility by 30 to 50 basis points.
Wow.
So from a risk-adjusted return perspective, there was a case to be made that carbon as an asset class should be included into institutional portfolio. Now, what's even more interesting about carbon markets is actually carbon markets has low correlation to every other asset class, meaning it has low correlation to equity markets, fixed income, private equity, real estate, infrastructure, even commodities. So there is a diversification benefit from owning carbon as an asset.
Yeah.
And within carbon markets, what's even more interesting is there is even low correlation between carbon markets, meaning the European allowance market versus the California carbon markets versus the project-based carbon markets have low correlation because the rules in which each of those markets are governed are slightly different.
Yeah.
Right. So for an
To
asset
mitigate,
owner,
it reduces risk around
reduces risk.
policy risk, etc.
Exactly.
Because they're all different, effectively in the silos. That's interesting.
Exactly. So
Never
if you're
thought
an
of that.
asset owner thinking about building a global diversified asset portfolio, the case was made, could we include carbon as an asset class, invest across those three pillars I mentioned, you get the diversification benefit of owning carbon as an asset class, but you also get a hedging benefit where if you own, let's say, an S&P 500 index, and you believe that carbon prices are going up, and this is going to flow through into the operating expense in the company's valuation, could owning carbon as an asset class and benefit from that hedge?
Of course.
Right? So this was kind of the thesis I had at the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Spending time there helped me build conviction in the carbon markets. So after spending several years there, I actually left to join a global investment bank here in Singapore to help set up their Asia environmental products business. And as we speak, I'm actually going to transition to a new venture within the environmental product space, but that's a story for another time.
Another day. No, we'll stay tuned for that.
Yes, exactly.
I think there's a lot of folks with bated breath trying to figure out where you're off to next.
Yes, but that's a story for another time. And for
You're
me,
welcome back anytime.
Yes. No, thanks so much. I think for me, it was clear in 2021 as it is today that there is no net zero scenario without the use of project-based interventions, either reduction or removals, because there will inevitably be some high-emitting industrial assets that cannot decarbonize and will need to use carbon removal technologies.
Yeah.
So I think that theme will continue to play out.
Great. So what an amazing background and so much to unpack. So, and I love the segmentation of how you framed it: the compliance market, the project-based market, and then what was the third one that you?
The private markets.
The private markets. So, can we dive into obviously 1 and 2 you've kind of expanded, but the private markets, can you expand on that? What that looks like?
Sure. So private market investments are ecosystem enablers. So if we think about the life cycle of creating a carbon credit, right? You have project developers who work with asset owners to try to develop a carbon project. That carbon project needs to be also registered at an existing program. So someone like a Vera or Gold Standard.
Yeah.
Right? It needs to go through certain VVB processes. So there are accounting firms involved, there are consulting firms involved, all the way until you actually generate that first ton of credit.
Yeah.
The credit is then issued into a digital platform, a registry. So someone like an IHS or an APX would own those registry services.
Yeah.
Right? So all these things can be invested in. Once the credits are issued, you can then invest in boutique broker-dealers or environmental product intermediaries that are helping to trade these assets, right? Either on exchanges as independent broker-dealer companies, right? And then you have a whole range of technology providers to be it carbon accounting services, digital MRV, you have the software, you have the accounting layer, you have the satellite imagery company. So this is the ecosystem that I'm talking about. Mostly private sector players today that we can invest in.
Okay, great. So I love that. Okay, so now can we kind of continue along these themes? I think the first two buckets, the compliance markets and the project-based markets, there's an interesting sort of nexus. There's an interplay between them. Can you take me through that, like that intersection, let's call that, between compliance and project-based carbon markets?
Sure. Rene, before answering this question, I thought I wanted to take a step back and maybe just share a little bit about what does carbon market do for us? What is its main purpose?
Sure.
For me, carbon markets is a tool to channel capital from high-emitting entities into technologies that help reduce or remove carbon emissions.
Great.
That's, for me, the fundamental purpose of the carbon markets, channeling that capital. Now, in the compliance carbon market, actually is highly liquid. It's a tradable system, trades over $1 trillion, like we mentioned earlier. And these are markets like in places like in Europe, in the UK, the East Coast of the US, California, and in China. Right? The project-based carbon market, on the other hand, is extremely nascent, but growing. And there is growing recognition, I think, where project-based carbon credits can be used as a complementary tool in compliance carbon programs, be it a carbon tax or an emissions trading system.
Yeah.
This is true in developed carbon markets in places like California, as it is in emerging carbon markets in places like China and in Singapore. So I don't think those are questionable. I think what is perhaps an area for discussion when we talk about this growing fungibility and convergence of project-based and compliance carbon market is how do we use the revenues that is generated from compliance markets and is those revenues used domestically in country or are they used internationally?
Okay.
So I'll give you some examples.
Please.
On one hand, compliance carbon markets, carbon tax and emission trading systems tends to be localized or regionalized programs. And therefore, authorities and regulators may have a preference to spend the revenue that is generated from this program in country domestically. So if you think about California and China, they both allow the use of project-based credits in the compliance program, but those project-based credits must come from within the country.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, on the other hand, I would argue that if we wanted to get the maximize the emission reduction potential per dollar spent, that dollar could be better spent in a country outside the compliance market, possibly in the global south, where the cost of abatement is lower.
Yeah, makes sense.
So here, if we look, I'll draw back on a research report that was written in 2019. The International Emission Trading Association, or IETA, and the University of Maryland have put out a report in 2019 highlighting that if countries were to cooperate to achieve their nationally determined contributions, or NDC, under Article 6, as opposed to independent implementation, the implementation cost of achieving these NDCs in 2030 could come down by $250 billion a year in 2030.
Significant.
Or it could also increase potential abatement by 5 gigaton at no additional cost. So you can see the benefit of actually redirecting some of the revenues that is generated from compliance programs into project-based credits in international markets where the cost of abatement is lower. So to the extent that there is fungibility and the growing fungibility between these two markets, then I would argue that actually a dollar that is generated in compliance market is better spent somewhere else.
Yeah, because of the cost basis.
The cost difference.
Yeah, that's fantastic. But so now coming to this intersection kind of component again, you just highlighted a number of these different markets where there is this fungibility of credits. And I love the fact that you're using this terminology around fungibility of project-based credit approaches as opposed to baseline and credit, as opposed to an allowance-based system.
Yep.
And you get these hybrids.
Yep.
It seems that the policy kind of direction following, kind of now as we enter into the implementation phase of Article 6, there's a lot of this cross-pollination of different policy makers that are looking to these type of hybrid models, whether it's a tax with a credit kind of dispensation or an allowance market with potential for credits or kind of a mixture, right? Where do you see these things sort of going? Where do you see this
Only
kind of
accelerating in the same direction.
Yeah?
So let's put some numbers into place, right?
On the same the rails in terms of architecture for Article 6? So 6.2 and 6.4 potentially?
Yes. So firstly, I think there will be more carbon pricing. So
Yep.
if we look over the last 20 years, the percentage of global greenhouse gases that has been covered by a compliance program, be it a tax or an emission trading system,
Yep.
went from 5% to 18% this year. So the trend is that there are more countries now putting legislation in place to put a price on carbon.
Yeah.
Remember earlier, I said that was one of the main hypotheses, right? That you had to put a price on this environmental externality.
Yeah.
Then the next question that we're asking is, okay, now that I have an initial price on carbon, how likely is it that I can fully decarbonize my country without the use of any project-based intervention? I think it's impossible.
I was going to say, what's the likelihood? It's close to zero.
I think it's impossible because if we think about the energy system, the energy system, there are a couple of areas that can be electrified. For example, land transportation can be electrified,
Sure.
but maybe not aviation and maritime.
No.
Electricity can be electrified.
Sure.
And then lastly is heating. I would say that for most residential heating, you can electrify it. But when you're doing industrial heating, when trying to make steel and cement, actually it might be very difficult to electrify. So there will inevitably be some high emitting industries that have no way to get to zero.
Yeah.
And they will need to use project-based interventions, right? There is no point, I think, in my opinion, having a carbon price that goes to 1,000 to 10,000 when there are removal technologies that can be achieved at lower price points.
Of course not. Yeah, it's a marginal abatement cost curve as you
Correct.
go up. Exactly. But that's really interesting. So you see the pace accelerating in terms of broader coverage. So this acceleration to sort of 18%. Now you think that this is the beginning of even more diffusion of carbon pricing systems globally. Coming back to the earlier question, following from Baku, and now sort of the great outcomes that came from this COP. Now effectively we have the rails onto which these trains can run. How do you see, and obviously within the Singaporean context, it's kind of evident around this Article 6.2 type of pathways, where you have these bilateral agreements between host countries evolve. So 6.2 and now the centralized control mechanism under 6.4. Where do you see those going?
I see greater harmonization across not just 6.2 and 6.4, but also the independent crediting programs like VERA and Gold Standard.
Yeah. Do they just become certification bodies? Is that the thesis?
Maybe not certification body, but I think that all these standards are creating methodologies. Anyway, a lot of these initial methodologies were created from the CDM era and edited and tweaked to create even national programs like we have, be it CCR in China or JCM in Japan, or independent crediting mechanisms like independent crediting bodies like VERA and Gold Standard. So I see greater harmonization of the methodologies over time. Who should play the arbiter of what is the best standard? I don't have an answer to that question.
Is that not the ICVCM though? Because effectively they're now super sort of body in terms of quality. Right?
Sure. So the ICVCM, I think, does a fantastic job in creating supply side integrity by assessing at the program level and at the methodology level what is a high quality carbon credit. But some would argue also that depending on why you're buying this, if you're buying a credit because it's a compliance obligation and the regulator says that at the program and methodology level, that level of granularity is sufficient, then maybe the ICVCM's approach could work. But if you are a corporate and you have very specific requests for a particular singular type of project that you're looking for, you only want to buy a biochar project from Indonesia or a RED Plus project from Africa, then maybe you might say, I want to do one level deeper. I want to actually get project level granularity.
Yeah.
And that is where maybe the ICVCM falls short of.
Yeah.
And
That's not their mandate.
yeah, that is not their mandate.
Yeah.
And there are others players like the carbon rating agencies who would step in to try to
provide.
fulfill some of that project level assessment.
Makes
So
sense.
again, I think it really depends on the use case. If you're doing it for a bespoke project specific, maybe even voluntary purpose, maybe you need the project level granularity. If you're using it for a compliance purpose, maybe at a more meta program or methodology level would be sufficient.
All right, so Alvin, I just want to continue basically what we were discussing earlier. I want to kind of take a little bit of a tack here, just if you'll indulge me. So given your background, you worked at a sovereign wealth fund and large institutional to investment banking. I want to get your perspective in terms of financial markets and carbon markets and kind of this intersection, but specifically through the lens of investability. We had a conversation. We were in Kuala Lumpur for an event, the Bursa Malaysia, a BCX event a couple months back, and we were on a panel together and we discussed this, and I found it to be really interesting. So, from the perspective in financial markets, what makes a project investable? I'll just hit you with that.
Thanks for the question. I think, in my personal opinion, when I look at assessing and financing carbon projects, what makes it investable and bankable comes down to how well the project developer is mitigating these three risks.
Great.
The first risk that I'm looking at is country and political level risk. The second one is merchant and price risk. And the third one is project performance risk.
Okay.
So I'll kind of expand on each of those.
Yes, please.
Traditionally, carbon projects today have been funded out of equity, and therefore the cost of financing a project is extremely high. But this high cost of financing is justified, I think, because the risk of this project is also very high.
Yeah.
Now, if we want to scale project-based carbon markets, we need the financing model to look a lot more like an infrastructure financing model, where a lot of this risk can be mitigated before even project implementation.
Okay.
So let's break it down. The first risk we talk about is country and political level risk. Here, I'm asking myself, does the project developer have the permits and the licenses from the host country to operate the said project in the host country?
Yeah.
Does the host country allow the program, project, and methodology to be implemented in the host country?
That's the first check.
That's the first check.
Yeah.
I'm also checking for things like, does the host country have the capability and the willingness to provide things like a letter of authorization and the corresponding adjustment for Article 6 transactions?
Yeah.
Now, some of this risk can be mitigated. For example, in the last 2 or 3 years, carbon markets have actually developed certain insurance tools. Now you can buy political insurance to cover for things like forced abandonment of the project, expropriation risk, the risk of revocating a letter of authorization to cover for some of this risk.
Yeah.
But that's one area that I'm trying to assess.
Okay. So what can project developers do, if I can just interject there, to help to deliver on that promise, right? So as you're evaluating from an investability perspective and you're looking at that sovereign risk, is it that they've engaged with the government, that they have the requisite permits, that they have letters of no objection from different ministries, subsequently letters of authorization, and then they take out the insurance policy? Is that the kind of trajectory of what you're looking for?
Yes, this is exactly what I'm looking for.
Okay.
I'm looking whether or not the project developer has engaged sufficiently with the host country, right, and help mitigate some of this risk through insurance policy and contractually binding contracts that can be legally enforceable under some of these insurance policies.
Okay. Yep. So that's the first one. That's the effectively.
That's the first one.
All right,
country and political risk.
Right to operate within the country.
Right to operate within the country.
Yep.
Now, moving on, the second risk that I'm looking at is merchant risk or price risk. Right? As a lender into a project, I want to know that this project has an off-taker, preferably from someone with a high credit quality, like a large corporate, for example.
Yeah.
What does that do for me as a lender? It gives me certainty of the cash flows that will come if the project is to deliver the said carbon credits in the
Which
future.
is bucket 3 in terms of risk. Yeah.
About delivery risk. But if I can deliver, I want to know that there is a buyer of the credit that mitigates this merchant risk.
Okay. Yep. Which kind of brings it back to your analogy around infrastructure, right? So for an energy project that you've got a PPA.
Correct. You have a PPA.
Yep. Okay.
Right? So you're not taking as much merchant risk.
Yep. Okay.
Right. The third bucket of risk that we're trying to mitigate is project performance risk. So this is the risk of how do I know that if a project developer says he's going to generate 1 ton of carbon credit, it is actually 1 ton and not 0.8 or 0.6.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
Here I'm assessing, does the project developer and the host country have experience in developing this program, project type, and methodology in the country? Do they have a track record in doing it?
Okay.
Right? I am also then looking for whether or not there are certain insurance that have been bought against things like export ban of certain carbon credits due to country or project level risk, changes in methodologies that result in less carbon credits being issued.
Which is a common theme right now that's afflicting the market.
Right? We have seen this happen even in recent times. I'm also looking at, are there certain letter of credits or guarantees that someone can provide in the event of project developer insolvency?
Okay. So that's a pretty comprehensive package. So if I can just kind of rewind and kind of summarize that. So you're looking for further mitigation at the merchant risk and performance risk within sub-buckets 2A and 2B. The merchant risk is obviously through offtakes, de-risking the effectively the discounted forward cash flows for those projects, right? Or for that project proponent, the merchant in this case. And then the performance fee, I really want to dive into that. So we've seen adjustments to methodologies, for example, most notably with regards to VERA's RED Plus and unplanned deforestation methodologies from VM007 to VM0048. And we see this adjustment with a much more conservative baseline, meaning that there's a lesser quotient, let's say, in terms of potential for issuance. So how does a project developer adjust for that kind of really kind of violent change with regards to methodology? How do they impress upon you from the investment community that this is a worthwhile project to invest in? Is it having a very conservative approach with what they're promising around future issuances?
I think there are two to three ways we can mitigate this risk.
Yep.
Firstly, you could contractually pass on this risk of changes in project methodology to the off-taker. So the off-taker takes the risk of lower carbon credits being issued, but then they own 100% potentially of all credits issued.
Okay, so shortfall kind of protection.
Okay, so that's one way. Two is, to the extent that these methodologies have been in the market for a while, there are ways to buy insurance to compensate for failure to deliver or shortfalls in delivery. Right? So I would say these are the two main mechanisms.
Okay.
Yeah. The third one is maybe we are talking about offtake as 100%, but it doesn't have to be 100%. Most times, project developers would sell a large portion of the credits, but not 100%. Because they never really know what the actual emission reduction numbers that's going to be verified at the end of the day is going to be. So there's always some room for buffer. So that buffer could be also factored into account for some of this risk.
Yeah, I've spoken to, and there's it's different in every case, but some project developers want to sell on a forward basis, 70, 80%. Right. Some, and we're speaking with one project developer at the moment, is looking to sell 50%, right, on a forward basis, but they have a much larger in terms of potential for scale, so they can ameliorate their internal burn rate, like cash flows, et cetera, by selling 50%. The thesis is that if they keep that buffer, it protects them against the shortfall in terms of potential issuance. And then also it allows them to take advantage of a rising tide in a market should the market continue to sort of escalate with regards to pricing. So,
Correct.
So they're not just naked in terms of the position for selling at today's pricing on the forward curve.
Absolutely. And so, to your original question, what makes a project investable? I think for projects that can sufficiently address these three risks and mitigate them, they become a lot more investable and bankable.
Okay.
Allows for debt financing to potentially be put into the project, lowers the overall cost of financing.
Yep. And does that come from debt financing as opposed from equity, correct?
As opposed to equity, so debt financing, a lower cost of financing costs. And hopefully that then makes this asset look a lot more infrastructure-like, as opposed to today, it's actually more like a venture capital investment funding it out of equity.
I really like that analogy, and it's not the first time obviously I've heard it from you, but I really want to expound on that because I think that this market has been in this kind of paradigm of venture capital, and when the market was running, capital was plentiful. But as other sort of macroeconomic factors have played a role here with regards to increasing interest rates, inflation, et cetera, that venture capital, that risk-on capital has effectively retreated pretty significantly. And so the market needs to adjust to what you're saying with regards to understanding how to price in these risks, understand that this is a new paradigm, and now future-proof itself for the future and prepare for scale, hence the transition towards a much more debt finance type of model. Because those kind of quotients of capital are orders of magnitude greater with regards to debt financing than in the venture side. Would you agree?
Absolutely. And actually, I failed to mention there is one group of market participants that who can come in to de-risk this project. I think there are government grants.
Yep.
There is philanthropic capital. There's developmental finance institutions that can come in to help de-risk this project for institutional investors, either through concessionary capital, so cheaper cost of capital, or through first loss capital.
Okay.
Right. So I would love to see for this group of participants come in to support the development of the carbon markets.
I think we saw an early example of that. I won't point out the names, but I think folks can kind of infer what I'm going to say, where you had a multilateral development bank step in to provide that loss capital component, and then effectively a carbon-linked bond on the back end being taken by a big financial institution to then distribute that. That kind of sets a nice precedent for how these markets can kind of be approached, right? I spoke to those financial institutions, both the multilateral and the big financial, and they said, look, this is an approach that they hope to then replicate, but it's not a fixed model. It's going to be bespoke pretty much every time that they go out to market to create these bond instruments. But in theory, the fixed income markets are enormous in terms of their capacity for capital. But this, if replicable by de-risking, could really help to underwrite the growth in the market in terms of capital finance. Okay, cool. Can we go back just a little bit? Because I think that we might have run really quickly over the third bucket. Okay, so we talked about sovereign risk insurance and then effectively that merchant risk and performance risk. What's the third bucket?
The third bucket is actually project performance risk.
Okay.
So we talked about how we know if the project developer says that it's a 1 ton of CO2 emission reduction, it is actually 1 and not 0.8.
No, 0.8. Okay.
Right? So there, I think we're assessing the track record
of
the project developer and the host country in developing the said program, project type, and methodology implemented in the country. And to the extent possible, to buy insurance to cover for things like export bans, changes in methodology, or less than expected credits being issued out of the project.
Okay, cool. All right, great. So can we now pivot? That was really a masterclass. So thank you for that, because the way you framed it, I think people can take a lot of lessons from that. And I really think that there'll be a lot of replays on this section because of where you've expounded it. And certainly, I'm thinking project developers, a lot of folks that we speak with and folks that we're working with that can learn from this type of approach to get their projects to an investable grade, so they can then take it to financiers and essentially say, hey, look, here it is, wrapped up with a nice, pretty pink bow on it.
Yep.
So I kind of want to go a little bit further afield and talk about something that we casually spoke about a little while ago, and I really want to kind of get off my chest as well. But it's this kind of quality component. We talked about ICVCM and the different programs, and you kind of alluded to methodologies. One of the things that kind of oftentimes just gets baked into the cake is vintage.
Okay.
Can I get your perspectives on the importance or the non-importance of vintage in terms of investable decision making as part of a portfolio?
I love this question, and of course we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of talking about what makes a high quality credit.
No, we're
but
not.
Vintage specifically.
Let's focus on vintage.
Yeah, vintage specifically. I actually think that vintage should not be a primary consideration in determining the quality of a carbon project.
Great. I completely agree, but I want to hear your perspective, and then I want to give you my perspective because I feel a sense of responsibility for kind of baking it into the cake.
Sure. But just having said that, to be fair, a lot of the corporates that I've worked with in the past do ask for a trailing 5-year vintage requirement. Meaning if the corporate is buying carbon credits for its calendar year 2024 emissions, it wants to buy carbon credits from vintage 2019 to 2023. Now, some of the common reasons for this type of criteria is as follows. The first one is that corporates are trying to match their year of operational emissions with the vintage of the carbon credit.
Yep.
This is a concept that was brought forth actually also in the renewable energy certificate market, where they're trying to match the same calendar year. The second reason I often hear is that younger vintage uses methodologies and MRVs that are more robust and therefore are of higher quality. And the third reason that I often hear for advocating for younger vintages is that older vintages have been issued, circulating in the market for a long time. There were no buyers, and therefore there's this perception that these credits are cheaper and therefore of lower quality. Okay. Now I'm going to share a little bit about why I think
Yeah, please, I want to hear this.
vintage is or should not be a primary consideration for project quality. Scientifically speaking, I would argue that a ton of carbon emission removed or reduced today has more value than one that is reduced or removed in the future.
Yep.
Some people
From a climate perspective.
From a climate perspective.
Yeah. Let's just let that sink in for a lot of people.
From an environmental perspective.
Yeah.
Okay. Some of us call this the time value of carbon, which means that a cut in greenhouse gas emission today has more impact, more positive environmental impact than a cut that is promised in the future.
Great.
Right? Because delaying these cuts have repercussions to global environmental impact. Right? So that's one of the main pushbacks where I say actually vintage. I will almost argue that older vintage should be worth more because scientifically they have more value. The second reason why I don't think vintage should be a primary consideration is because when we register a project, sometimes it takes 2 to 3 years before the project gets verified and issued. So this project used the same project design document, same methodology versioning, monitoring report, verification report, and then chose a date 3 years later to simultaneously issue all 3 vintages at the same time. How can we justify that the younger vintage is worth more than the older vintage when everything is actually the same?
Yeah, it is. So I love this, and I really want to focus and kind of emphasize is the word I'm looking for. If I could put an exclamation mark here, I'll talk to my editors to put it in afterwards. Is this time value of carbon like theory is really, really important, and I think it's oftentimes just like swept under the carpet, and it ought not to be because of the reasons that you mentioned. Coming back to the reasons why there's a preference for newer, like this recency bias towards vintages. Can I give you my perspective?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So when I started, ICROA, the International Carbon Reduction Offset Alliance, of which a lot of the main sort of practitioners in this market are members, came out with the various different principles. It's kind of a predecessor to the core carbon principles. A lot of people forget this, but one of those principles was around synchronicity, around this try to match your year of emissions as close to as possible to the current vintage or crop that you're buying these carbon credits. Why? It was a view that, yeah, you want to try to have it like in the rec market, some level of correlation. It's a nice to have. Most corporates took this kind of view of, well, yeah, let's do T minus 5 years or Y minus 5 years, right? Let's look back 5 years. And that came back actually from a paper in the World Bank published a long time ago saying this is kind of good practice. It then became embedded, and I'll put my hand up with regards to that, and I'll come back to it. But it was kind of an unspoken rule, but oftentimes there was a lack of supply on the forward curve, like the newer issuances, and there was plentiful supply of the older vintages, and they were at a discount. Why? Because there's just more availability, and those became attractive. Then what we saw was the market effectively eroding those older vintages, and we saw that in 2020. Climadow took out a lot of the old vintages, and we started to see this kind of acceleration towards sort of recent issuances, and more demand starting piling in. That was now the time, in terms of context, where folks like myself played a role, and my team and I wrote the first standardized instruments in the carbon market. And in the specifications, we codified this unwritten rule, and we baked it into the cake. So with the geo, okay, that was a reflection of the CORSIA pilot phase, and so that was vintage was already kind of set by ICAO. But with regards to the NGO, which reflected the AFLU basket, predominantly red plus credits, we codified that with a rolling vintage, with a look back effectively of the 5 years. And so that became the norm effectively for trading desk, and then became adopted as effectively as wisdom or
correct, almost like a best practice for corporates.
But it became like the rule set. So now traders were like, well, anything that's outside of that scope, we don't want it. That trades at a steep discount. And then there was this kind of distrust within the corporate sphere, like why this other stuff that's older being sold at a steep discount? It's just because of the structure of the contracts. We had a forward-facing contract that was incentivizing new investment into new projects, right? And then as the vintages kind of rolled forward, you'd have a drop-off. Those older vintages fell into a trailing contract, with the intention being that corporates could effectively sign up to that contract and effectively take off these credits that would be discounted from the financial intermediaries. But it's not been adopted. Everyone's kind of piled in on the front front part of that wagon
Yep.
and not the back part. So it's kind of a bit of a bug and not a feature that we intended. And I'll speak for myself. I don't want to kind of put it back on my former folks at the institutional level, but I certainly have this conversation oftentimes with corporates to say, great, the 2018 vintage, given your analogy, like look back to 2019, is equally comparable to a 2019 or 2020 vintage, but it's trading at a slight discount. This is actually beneficial to you to save a bit of money.
Yep.
Right? And how about the market?
So I guess
oversupply?
we're agreeing, Rene, that
We're completely
actually
agreeing.
vintage may not be a sign of quality.
It's not a sign of
Younger
quality.
does not
Let's get that-
equals better.
I
Actually,
don't
older
kind of
might be
agree.
both.
I definitely agree. It is an absolute exclamation
Yeah.
point. It is not a sign of quality. It is just a buying preference. But like when we look at other things, vintage matters for wines. There's particularly great vintages in wines,
Yeah.
and people like the older vintages. There's this kind of approach that we've taken in carbon. Sometimes perplexes the mind, but I feel like an obligation to kind of
No,
vent.
thanks so much
No, so
for
thank you
sharing.
for the opportunity for letting me to vent. Now I'm just conscious. I'm drinking my drink and you're not. Maybe I'll let you
Right.
catch up and we catch our breaths. Thanks. So Alvin, in the interest of continuity, just to point out, we're having another cocktail that's been made for us. Thank you for obviously everything that we've discussed. Love the the dialogue and the conversation here in terms of where we're going. I want to now kind of come back to the personal. You recently posted something on LinkedIn that I thought was really wonderful, talking about the importance of mentorship for yourself and kind of your story. You were featured in local media here as well with regards to your story. So I want to kind of dive into that. I want to unpack sort of why is mentorship important to you, and then the importance of education as a kind of a follow-on, because not only have you got this very distinguished career, but you're also giving back to in terms of academia to the next generation.
No, I think thanks so much. And I think you really pointed out earlier this year, I actually joined the National University of Singapore Center for Governance and Sustainability as a senior fellow, where I will contribute to thought leadership and also teach a couple of classes in sustainability and carbon markets. I've always had a desire to mentor and share knowledge. And I've done this through some of teaching engagements with Columbia University, where I did my master's degree, with the National University of Singapore, and then next year also with the Nanyang Technological University. To be completely honest with you, I was a bit of a late bloomer. Meaning I
find that so hard
I
to
didn't
believe.
do so well academically up until pretty much college.
Really? I find that super hard to believe that you were a wild child. No, incredible.
Well, that's a story for another time. But I
got to have you back then for an episode 2.
But I was very fortunate to have mentors guide me along the way. Both academic mentors in college and also senior corporate leaders who have supported me as a young professional. And I felt that it was only necessary that now I pay this forward, and I also spend time supporting and mentoring other students studying in the colleges that I mentioned, but also young professionals looking to transition into sustainability and carbon markets.
I love that. I want to unpack that furthermore, because I feel that same sort of responsibility to pay it forward, because I've also benefited from really incredible mentors, people that took the time to actually help and listen and guide and provide feedback that when it was critical, it was really valuable, and also to support and to encourage, which is also really helpful. That paying it forward is really important. And so you kind of touch a little bit on how you're paying it forward. But can you expand on some of the kind of teachings that you learned from your mentors in different walks of life?
Sure. I think as a student or young professional, sometimes I lack the vision to see what was possible.
Yeah, good
and
point.
in having a mentor share with you their own life experiences, their own challenges, you can then start to visualize that actually the things that you're going through today is just a process that everyone goes through, and that if you can visualize this future, that you could actually achieve it. Right? Maybe just building on that a little bit. If I look over the next 20 to 30 years, for me, there are certain themes that are going to be integral to global development that I don't think are going away.
Okay, what are those?
The first one is artificial intelligence or AI. The second one is digitalization. And the third one is decarbonization. Let's take a look at decarbonization as a theme, because it's a lot closer to what we're doing in carbon markets.
Although we're seeing an intersection of some of the others playing a key role in these industries, in all industries.
Right. BCG had put out a report sometime back saying that the world is going to need between 100 and 150 trillion dollars if we are going to successfully transition into this low carbon economy over the next 30 years. Some of these themes are already playing out over the last 20 years. For example, in energy sector, we are seeing the transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. In transportation, within land transportation, we are seeing the transition from internal combustion engines into electric vehicles. But there are a lot more opportunities around in the decarbonization theme. In areas like maritime and aviation decarbonization, real estate, industrial decarbonization, and how we use agriculture and our forestry assets more optimally. So one of the things I really encourage students and young professionals is hopefully that they can try to take their expertise and their time and invest it in some of these themes. Hopefully I have a bias towards decarbonization as a theme, and work on something that's helping to reduce emissions and decarbonize our global economy. Because these are structural 20, 30, 40-year themes that I don't think are going to go away.
Yeah, I completely agree. But that mentorship role, helping them to effectively visualize the future, to see there's an opportunity for them to contribute and to provide the solutions is really important. Oftentimes in mentorship, it's the encouragement component is really it's so worthwhile and necessary, because like you said, you don't have the perspective of experience and kind of life to kind of see where things head. So you're coming in, it's the first time you're seeing it. And someone that's been there, kind of done that, has seen the different kind of iterations of the markets and just the realities of corporate life, can help to guide that young person that might be becoming disillusioned, to help them to remain on track and to stay on that track, as well as to provide the subject matter expertise and that kind of influence. So that's really great. And so now coming to the kind of the output of that, which is you giving back. You mentioned obviously the two of the large institutions here in terms of tertiary education institutions, NUS and NTU. Can you give me sort of a prelude in terms of what you're teaching and what you're hoping to kind of manifest from these, kind of paying it forward?
Sure. So one of the things that we're doing at both the National University of Singapore and the Nanyang Technological University is to launch series of courses at the undergraduate, graduate, and executive education level, with the hope of kind of sharing and imparting more sustainability and carbon market knowledge to a broader reach of audience. Right? I think some of the fundamental concepts that we're trying to get across is something like what I mentioned earlier about the hypothesis. Right? People need to realize, I think, that carbon markets is an effective market-based mechanism to put a price on carbon and channel finance and capital to technologies that reduce and remove emissions. And there is no way we get to net zero without the use of some project-based intervention. At a high level, this is a 2-sentence summary. But how do we break that down into practical and investable opportunities at each sector level? What are the policies that needs to be put in place? Both private sector and public sector needs to work together. And that's what I think some of these courses are trying to accomplish.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, cool. Can I add one other component that I hope that will then beget even more results? I think the continuity piece, right? You benefited from mentors, I benefited from mentors, and then now you're at the point of giving back because you've kind of, your career is, you've had a long and extensive career. Same in terms of my background, 15 years in this space. Now I feel an obligation, a sense of obligation to pay it forward. The only rule I ever ask in terms of my mentor-mentee relationships is, two rules. One, just willingness to engage and work hard effectively, and the other one is to pay it forward. My hope is that then you plant a seed in then the next generation, that then they continue to pay it forward, so that it's a sustainable and perpetual kind of cycle.
Absolutely.
So I want to drink to that.
Completely agree.
Yeah. Cheers.
Cheers. Cool.
Now, kind of coming back to something a little bit more technical, if you'll indulge me. You've been part of some interesting work over the last, I think, 18 months or a little bit more, with regards to something that maybe a lot of folks haven't digested just yet, but it was regards to energy transition and this intersection with carbon markets, the energy transition credits. In particular, it stemmed from a white paper that the Monetary Authority of Singapore published in coalition with McKinsey a little while back, But you've been actively engaging from financial institutions' perspective in and around how this very difficult problem is addressed. Can you firstly unpack the problem and then give me a sort of an update in terms of where things are at?
Sure. So I want to start with some assumptions in this market.
Yeah, sure.
And just to reiterate some of the points that I made earlier in our discussion. Carbon markets are an effective market-based mechanism to channel capital from high-emitting entities to lower emissions reduction and removal activities. We need both tech and nature, reduction and removal technologies. They're all required. But if there are two technology types that I think really move the needle for global decarbonization, they are firstly, the transition to renewable energy, and secondly, the preservation and restoration of our agriculture and forest land.
Yeah.
So that's the two things that I think move the needle. And I want to talk a little bit about scaling the transition to renewable energy. And one of the most exciting innovations in the carbon markets is actually using carbon markets as a tool to accelerate early coal phase out. Right?
As a catalyst.
As a catalyst.
Yeah.
Right? Decarbonizing coal-fired power plants is going to be extremely important if Asia is going to achieve its net zero.
Okay, I want to dive into that. Can I just put a pin
Sure.
here? Why Asia?
Why Asia? Well, Asia has a very young fleet of coal-fired power plants. The average age of a coal-fired power plant here is only 15 years old.
Yeah, whereas in other parts of the developed world, they're much further in terms of
20,
maturity.
30 plus years old.
Exactly,
So they're
and,
much
and the
older.
lifetime of a lot of these installations, these facilities, 40 years.
At least 30,
plus.
40 years easily,
Yeah.
right? So that's one reason. The second one is that coal-fired power plant accounts for 60% of Asia's power generation. We have over 2,000 coal-fired power plant installations all across Asia, accounting for 7 gigaton of CO2. 7 billion tons of CO2, that's a lot.
That's a lot.
Right? So for Asia to decarbonize and achieve net zero, we need to find a solution.
It's 12.5% of the global budget.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Yeah.
We need to find a way to to phase out coal-fired plants earlier. Now, there are challenges to achieving this. I'll give you 3 main considerations.
Yep.
Right? The first one is the economic interest of the parties. How do we find enough capital such that the equity holder, the debt holder, and the power purchase agreement holder today are fairly compensated to close out of their position earlier than expected?
Okay.
The second consideration is energy security. As we phase out coal-fired power plants, we need to find an alternative source of energy, preferably lower carbon, something like renewable energy. Because in most developing markets in Asia, power consumption is still growing.
Yeah.
So we need to find a low carbon alternative. The third consideration is a just transition. Coal-fired power plant supply chains hires a significant number of people. So how are we going to reskill, retool the displaced workers if we were to phase out coal-fired power plants early, and also to ensure that end users have uninterrupted, affordable electricity?
Yeah.
If we can solve for these 3 main considerations, then I think we have a real shot at decarbonizing and accelerating the early coal phase out of coal-fired power plants.
I completely agree, but it's a monumental task, and it's multi-layered in terms of this complexity. So, okay, the key word there, the operative word being accelerating the energy transition, because it's in terms of, can I take it back? Like at some point in time, there's going to be a transition, but it might be in 30 years' time when these plants reach maturity. We don't have that luxury of time. So how do we accelerate it whilst focusing on those three buckets: the equitable compensation component, the energy security perspective, and then the just transition? How is this done, and how do carbon markets play a role within that?
Sure. Firstly, I think we need to bring in some concessionary capital from some of the developmental finance institutions or the public sector to help already take down some of the costs associated with compensating the existing economic interests of parties, the debt and the equity holders.
Sure.
So that's 1. 2, we need to be able to bring in things like renewable energy technology, and preferably renewable energy with storage at a price point that is competitive in the local market, so that we get continuous access of electricity without increasing costs
So no disruption
So
to,
no-
to
no
the access
disruption.
of clean and reliable energy.
Correct.
Yeah,
Correct.
and cheap.
Correct, right? And where carbon market can play a role is in financing and subsidizing some of this incremental costs, so that without carbon financing, these projects may not be able to phase down earlier.
Yeah.
But with the carbon financing, now we have that additional capital to make sure everyone is fairly compensated and we can get alternative energy at affordable prices for the host country, right, and implement this project.
Okay. So I mean that you just gave an explanation of what is additionality, right? So there's a financial additionality requirement for the carbon financing to effectively help to underwrite this. Okay. So now it kind of brings it back in terms of intersection of the things that we talked about before around the bankability, investability of projects, but also the intersection with compliance markets. I would imagine. Can you expand on that component? Because I don't think the voluntary markets can just purely support this energy transition. You said it's 7. Did you say 7,000? You said 7 gigatons, 2,000 plus.
2,000 plus coal-fired power
Coal-fired
plants
power plants.
generating
Yeah.
7 gigatons of
That's a
carbon
lot.
dioxide.
Yeah. So okay, which are the carbon markets that can effectively help to support this from a pricing perspective?
I think one of the main markets that's going to support the demand buyers of these type of carbon credits is actually going to be countries that have to comply with the Paris Agreement and to use this to meet their national determined contribution goals.
Great. So it was a leading question. So great. So
that is going to be one major buying segment.
Yeah.
Now, where is the money going to come from? The money could come from host countries' own compliance program to the extent that these credits are fungible with their compliance program.
Now you're bringing it full circle to what you discussed earlier around the efficiency in terms of allocation of that capital raised from these compliance systems. So if you have a cap and trade system, now you could allocate proceeds from the sale of those auctions, let's say, into these decarbonization initiatives within other sectors. Okay. Okay. And now there's a transfer essentially of an ITMO on the back end.
Correct.
Okay.
That's the channeling of capital from high emitting entities towards technologies that help reduce or remove carbon emissions at a lower price point internationally.
Okay. And that helps to facilitate the just energy transition piece of scaling up renewables with battery storage at a lower cost, helping to obviously, and I want to come dive into this just transition piece, but helps accelerate that transition away from coal. I think that's really important because you said from a pure budget perspective, when it represents 7 gigatons out of a 50 gigaton budget annually, like we're very quickly depleting our budget, right?
We need to find a solution to phase out coal-fired power plants.
Yeah.
Otherwise, there is no net zero in Asia.
Great. Okay, so it's hugely important. So how is the traction going in terms of this very complex objective and this very complex sort of playing field, different multiple stakeholders, et cetera, actually developing currently?
I think we're making good progress. Through the use of concessionary capital from some of the developmental finance institutions, we can already bring down the useful life, operational life of a coal-fired power plant. The question is, can we then augment this with carbon revenue streams to bring it down even more?
Yeah. Okay, and so what's required in order to get it to that point?
Well, we need to have willing buyers, countries that are willing to stamp up the capital to fund some of these decarbonization projects in the global south, especially in Asia, where we have a lot of coal-fired power plants.
And do you think that call has been heard following? We just finished Baku, the COP29. Is this message being made loud and clear and kind of shouted from the rooftops?
Well, I think it is. I think the message is clear,
Yep.
and I'm glad to see the operationalization of Article 6.4. Hopefully, that will be another mechanism in which we get more capital channeled from developed nations to the developing nations who are providing some of the solutions to help decarbonize and to reduce our emissions even faster.
I completely agree. Would Article 6.2 also provide a framework here?
I think
for the
Article 6
bilateral sort of
absolutely,
country
I
to
think
country?
it would.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So there's a lot of hope there in terms of what this could certainly in terms of what it could deliver in terms of the significant at gigaton potential reductions. And so this is at scale with big underlining.
And just to build on your point around Article 6.2, actually 6.2 has more flexibility embedded into it to allow for some of these new and novel project types as opposed to 6.4.
Yeah.
Right. So if there is a new innovation in the market, it is likely that 6.2 can adopt it a lot faster.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a call essentially to policymakers to look at this opportunity effectively. Would you say that's correct? Okay, and also financial institutions, concessionary capital, and also private capital to step in and help to bridge that gap? Okay, and then to the carbon markets that will also ultimately follow. So I think in a few years' time, people will come back to this episode and say, okay, thank you, Alvin. Cool. Mate, we could keep talking for hours, but I'm conscious you're a busy man. But thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Wish you continued success. And when you're ready to come back onto the podcast to talk about your next endeavor, I'd love to have you back.
Wonderful. Rene, thank you so much for having me here today.
My pleasure. Thank you, man. Cheers.
Cheers.
Thanks.